A German prisoner of war stood frozen in the doorway of an American farmhouse kitchen, watching something impossible. An elderly American woman was stirring a pot of beef stew and humming softly to herself. She looked up, smiled, and said in broken German, "Hungry boy." He had been told American civilians would spit on him, throw stones, curse his very existence. Instead, this grandmother was cooking him dinner. This is the story of the most unexpected kindness in wartime history, and it's about to change everything you think you know about enemies and humanity. Hans Müller was 19 when American forces captured him near the Rhine in March 1945. A farm boy from Bavaria who'd been drafted into the Wehrmacht just 8 months earlier. He'd spent more time learning to fear American civilians than American soldiers. The Nazi propaganda had been explicit and terrifying. American women were particularly vicious toward German prisoners. They would scratch their eyes, pour boiling water on them, set dogs on them in the streets. American children were taught from birth to hate Germans with a fanatical intensity that made them more dangerous than trained soldiers. Here's what German soldiers were told to expect. While only 1% of German POWs would die in American custody, American civilians would be far more brutal than military personnel. The home front was described as a nest of hatred where every woman was a potential executioner. Remember, his Sergeant Johann Weber had warned before the final battle, if you're captured, the soldiers might follow rules. But the civilians? They will tear you apart with their bare hands. They blame you personally for every American boy who died overseas. German newspapers had published horrific stories. German prisoners forced to run naked through American towns while crowds threw bottles and stones. Women spitting in their faces and screaming curses. Children taught to kick and bite any German they encountered. When the Americans marched him and 50 other prisoners through the town of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, Hans braced for the assault. Surely the townspeople would emerge with clubs and knives, eager for revenge against representatives of the regime that had killed their sons and husbands. Instead, something impossible happened. An elderly woman on her front porch waved. Not a hostile gesture, not a curse or threat, just a wave. Like she might offer a neighbor. Hans blinked, certain he'd misunderstood. But as the column of prisoners continued through town, more civilians appeared. Some stared with curiosity. Others ignored them entirely. A few children pointed and asked their mothers questions in hushed English. But no one threw stones. No one spat. No one screamed for German blood. This must be the calm before the storm, Hans thought. They're planning something worse. But what happened when he reached the work farm would shatter every belief he had about American women. Camp Letterkenny, Pennsylvania, wasn't a traditional prison camp. It was part of a work program where German POWs were assigned to local farms desperately short of labor due to American men fighting overseas. Hans found himself assigned to the Henderson farm, 30 miles outside Harrisburg. The truck ride through Pennsylvania countryside was surreal. Rolling green hills, neat farmhouses with white picket fences, children playing in yards. This looked nothing like the war-torn wasteland he'd expected America to be. The Henderson farm was a modest 160-acre operation. Corn and wheat fields, a vegetable garden, Holstein cattle, and Rhode Island red chickens. The farmhouse was white clapboard with blue shutters, surrounded by ancient oak trees that cast gentle shadows across the yard. Mrs. Margaret Henderson emerged from the house as the truck arrived. She was perhaps 62 years old, silver-haired, wearing a simple floral house dress and blue apron. Her husband Robert had died of a heart attack the previous winter, the camp commander explained, and she needed help with the spring planting. Hans expected her to eye him with suspicion, maybe retreat to the house and watch from behind curtains. Instead, she walked directly up to him, looked him up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd been evaluating farm workers for decades, and nodded approvingly. "He's too thin," she announced to the American guard in English that carried traces of a German accent. Then, turning to Hans, she spoke in careful, heavily accented German. "Du sprichst English?" "Little bit," Hans replied cautiously, surprised by her linguistic attempt. "Gut, I speak little bit German. My grandmother, she came from Württemberg in 1885. We understand each other, yes?" She gestured toward the farmhouse with work-worn hands. "Come, first we eat, then we work. Nobody works on empty stomach on Henderson Farm." The American guard looked surprised. "Mom, you don't need to feed him. He gets rations back at camp." Mrs. Henderson fixed the guard with a look that could have withered corn in July. "Young man, my grandmother always said, 'Der Mensch ist, was ist.' You are what you eat. A working man needs proper food, not camp slop. I don't care if he's German, Japanese, or from the moon." Hans followed her toward the house, his mind reeling. This woman, whose country was at war with his, whose neighbors' sons were dying fighting his countrymen, was not just inviting him to eat in her home, but speaking his grandmother's language. But when he stepped into that kitchen, what he discovered would change his understanding of human nature forever. The Henderson kitchen was like something from a dream Hans had forgotten he could have. Warm yellow walls lined with wood beadboard, red and white checkered curtains fluttering in the breeze from open windows, the smell of yeast rolls rising in covered bowls on the counter, a massive pot of something savory simmering on the cast-iron stove, filling the room with aromas of beef, onions, and herbs. Mason jars of home-canned vegetables lined open shelves like a rainbow of preserved summer. Green beans, corn, tomatoes, peaches. Mrs. Henderson gestured for him to sit at a solid oak table worn smooth by decades of family meals, its surface scarred by knife marks and water rings that told stories of countless shared dinners. She moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and purposeful, ladling beef stew into a real ceramic bowl, blue and white spatterware that looked handmade, cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread so fresh it was still warm, pouring cold milk from a glass pitcher beaded with condensation, spreading real butter, not margarine, thick on the bread. Hans stared at the meal she placed before him. Beef stew with chunks of meat the size of his thumb, carrots, potatoes, pearl onions swimming in rich brown gravy that smelled of thyme and bay leaves, fresh bread with a golden crust and tender crumb, cold milk in a proper glass tumbler. This wasn't prison food. This wasn't even military food. This was what his grandmother used to call Sonntagsessen, Sunday dinner. "Iss," Mrs. Henderson commanded, settling into the chair across from him with her own bowl. "You're nothing but skin and bones. Reminds me of my grandson Tommy when he had that fever last year." Hans took a tentative spoonful of stew and nearly groaned with pleasure. The beef was fork tender, the gravy rich and complex, the vegetables cooked to perfection, but not mushy. When had he last tasted anything this good? Certainly not in the German army, where rations consisted mainly of ersatz bread and thin soup that tasted like dishwater. Mrs. Henderson watched him eat with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work was nourishing people. "Good? My Robert, God rest his soul. He said my beef stew could cure any ailment known to man. Secret is browning the meat first, then adding just a splash of red wine." Between bites, Hans managed to ask, "Warum? Why you do this?" "I am fined. Enemy." Mrs. Henderson considered this question while buttering her own bread, her movements deliberate. "You know what I see when I look at you, boy? I see my grandson Tommy. He's about your age, 19, fighting somewhere in the Pacific with Patton's Third Army. Every night I pray that if Tommy is hungry or scared or far from home, someone shows him kindness." She leaned forward, her blue eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You didn't start this war, did you? You're just a farm boy like my Tommy, caught up in something bigger than yourself. Way I see it, the only difference between you and him is which piece of dirt you happen to be born on." Hans felt tears welling in his eyes. When had anyone last spoken to him with such simple humanity? In the German army, he'd been Gefreiter Müller, serial number 4471859, a cog in the war machine. Here, in the kitchen of his supposed enemy, he was being treated like a person with a name and a story. But this was just the beginning, because what happened over the next few months would prove that one kitchen could become a battlefield for the human soul. Days settled into a routine that defied everything Hans thought he knew about captivity. Each morning, the olive-drab camp truck would drop him at the Henderson farm gate. Each morning, Mrs. Henderson would have breakfast waiting on blue willow china, 2 eggs over easy, thick-cut bacon from her own smokehouse, toast made from bread she'd baked before dawn, coffee that smelled like heaven, fresh orange juice in a glass pitcher. "Breakfast is the most important meal," she would say, watching him eat with satisfaction. "My grandmother used to say, Morgenstund hat Gold im Mund. The morning hour has gold in its mouth." The work was hard but honest, ploughing the back 40 with a team of draft horses, planting corn in perfectly straight rows, mending fence posts that had rotted over winter, milking the Holstein cows twice daily. Mrs. Henderson worked beside him despite her age, her energy impressive for a woman who'd been farming for 4 decades. She taught him American techniques he'd never seen in Bavaria, crop rotation methods, soil testing with simple chemistry, how to judge corn ripeness by the silk color. She shared stories about her late husband Robert, a veteran of the First War who'd fought against Germans in France, but never spoke of it with hatred. "Your mother, she must worry sick about you," Mrs. Henderson said one day, while they were weeding the vegetable garden, sweat staining their work shirts. "Ja," Hans replied, mixing German and English as had become their custom. She not know if I am alive or dead. Mrs. Henderson paused in her weeding, dirt-stained hands resting on her hips. That's not right. No mother should lie awake wondering about her boy. 2 days later, she emerged from the house with writing paper, envelopes, and a fountain pen with real ink. Write your letter, she said simply. Hans stared at the supplies. But this is verboten. Not allowed, yes? Son, some things are more important than military rules. Your mother is probably sick with worry, maybe thinks you're dead. That's a sin against God, war or no war. What she was offering was technically a federal crime. Unauthorized correspondence with enemy nationals could result in prosecution, imprisonment, loss of her farm. She was risking everything to ease a German prisoner's homesickness. Hans wrote carefully in his best penmanship, his hands trembling slightly. Liebe Mutter, I am alive and well in America. I cannot say much, but I'm working on a farm in Pennsylvania, where I am treated with great kindness by a woman who reminds me of Oma. The food is good, the work honest. Do not worry for me. I think of you and little Anna every day. Dein Sohn, Hans. Mrs. Henderson studied the address he'd written in careful script. I have a neighbour whose son is with the occupation forces in Munich. He might be able to get this delivered through proper channels. Over the following weeks, this dangerous correspondence continued. Mrs. Henderson also began receiving visitors, other local farm wives whose operations were hosting German POWs. How's your German boy working out, Margaret? Asked Mrs. Patterson, whose husband was fighting in Italy while she ran their dairy operation alone. He's the best hired hand I've ever had, Mrs. Henderson replied. Polite, grateful, works from sunup to sundown without complaint. Reminds me of our Tommy. Same age, same farm boy manners. Mine too. Wilhelm, his name is. Makes me wonder what we were all so afraid of. But the real test was coming, when the community discovered what Mrs. Henderson was really doing. Word began to spread through Lebanon County about Mrs. Henderson's treatment of her German prisoner. Not everyone approved of her Christian charity. One sweltering afternoon in late June, Hans was cultivating corn in the back 40 when he saw dust clouds on the road. More vehicles than usually passed the Henderson farm. He climbed down from the tractor and walked toward the house, a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. A crowd of perhaps 25 people had gathered in Mrs. Henderson's front yard. Their voices carried across the summer air, angry and accusatory. It's not right, Margaret, shouted Bill Morrison, whose eldest son Jimmy had been killed at Omaha Beach 13 months earlier. You're treating that Nazi like family, while our boys are dying in foxholes overseas. He's eating better than most Americans, added Mrs. Collins, whose husband was rationing everything to buy war bonds. My family's been stretching our meat ration for 2 years, while you're serving pot roast to the enemy. Hans dropped his hoe and started toward the house, unsure what he could do, but knowing he couldn't let Mrs. Henderson face this mob alone. He arrived to find her standing on her front porch, back ramrod straight, facing down the crowd with the calm dignity of someone who'd weathered 62 years of life's storms. Her voice was steady but firm. That boy has been working this farm for 8 weeks. He's never complained, never caused trouble, never shown anything but gratitude and respect. He fixes things that break, works harder than any hired hand I ever employed, and says grace before every meal. He's still German, Morrison spat, his face red with anger and grief. His people killed my Jimmy at Normandy. Mrs. Henderson's voice softened but didn't waver. No, Bill. Adolf Hitler killed your Jimmy. SS officers and Wehrmacht generals killed your Jimmy. That boy in my cornfield was probably helping his own father with harvest when this war started. Same as Jimmy was playing baseball for the high school team. The crowd murmured angrily, but Mrs. Henderson raised her hand for silence. You want to hate somebody. Hate the politicians who started this mess. Hate the fanatics who convinced decent people to march off and kill each other. But don't hate a scared farm boy who says please and thank you and writes letters to his mother. Hans stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. In his careful, accented English, he addressed the hostile crowd. I understand you have right to be angry with Germans. We did terrible things in this war, but Mrs. Henderson, she showed me that Americans are good people with good hearts. When I go back to Germany, I tell everyone, Americans are not the monsters our leaders said. Americans can choose kindness over hate. The silence stretched like taffy in the summer heat. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. Men shifted uncomfortably, looking at their shoes. Finally, Bill Morrison turned and walked toward his truck, shoulders sagging with grief that had nowhere else to go. Others followed, but several remained, looking uncertain and perhaps ashamed. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her voice tentative. Margaret, maybe you could teach me to make that German potato salad your grandmother used to prepare. My Wilhelm might appreciate a taste of home. The confrontation was over, but its effects would ripple through the community in ways no one expected. What had started as one woman's kitchen kindness became a quiet revolution in how central Pennsylvania viewed their former enemies. Mrs. Patterson did indeed learn to make Kartoffelsalat, using Mrs. Henderson's grandmother's recipe with vinegar and bacon instead of mayonnaise. Mrs. Williams started baking Apfelstrudel for her prisoner, rolling the dough paper thin just like the German cookbook instructed. The Lebanon Daily News, initially skeptical of the POW work program, began running articles that emphasized the prisoners' humanity. Heinrich Braun, 20, from a farming village near Nuremberg, has been helping the Kowalski family bring in their wheat harvest. He works harder than most hired hands we've had, reports Mrs. Anna Kowalski. Never complains about the heat, always respectful. Makes me think about my own boy somewhere in the Pacific. And the transformation wasn't universal. Some families remained coldly efficient, treating their assigned prisoners as nothing more than labor units. But enough hearts had been changed to create a network of unexpected kindness throughout the county. Hans began receiving care packages from other farm wives, oatmeal cookies wrapped in waxed paper, hand-knitted socks, bars of real soap, dog-eared books in German that somebody had found in attics. Mrs. Henderson started hosting Sunday dinners where several German prisoners and their host families would gather around her extended dining room table. These meals were remarkable for their ordinariness. German prisoners and American farm families passing dishes of fried chicken and corn on the cob, discussing weather patterns and crop prices, laughing at language mistakes, finding common ground in their shared understanding of rural life. You know, Mrs. Henderson said during one such dinner, carving a golden brown chicken, my grandmother always said you can't really hate someone once you've shared a meal with them. Food breaks down walls that armies can't breach. But the real test of these relationships was approaching, because when the war ended, everything would change. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Hans received the news while helping Mrs. Henderson process strawberries for jam, their hands stained red from hulling berries in the warm kitchen. They sat in silence, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of summer, birds singing, bees humming in the garden, the distant lowing of cattle. What happens now? Hans asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson continued cutting strawberries with mechanical precision. Now the real work begins. Now we have to figure out how to live together in peace instead of just surviving war. Repatriation would take months, perhaps a full year. The POW work program continued through the summer and into fall, giving these unlikely relationships time to deepen and mature. Mrs. Henderson used those months to teach Hans more than farming techniques. She lent him books about American democracy from her late husband's collection, helped him improve his English by reading newspapers aloud, encouraged him to think about what kind of life he wanted in whatever Germany would become. Your country's going to need rebuilding from the ground up, she told him one evening over blackberry cobbler. Going to need young men who understand that nations can be friends instead of enemies. Maybe that's your job now, building bridges instead of bunkers. When repatriation orders finally arrived in February 1946, the partings were wrenching. Mrs. Henderson packed a battered suitcase with clothes that had belonged to her late husband, jars of preserves from her cellar, packets of seeds from her garden, and photographs of the farm. "So you remember us," she said, tears streaming down weathered cheeks. "So you remember that not all Americans are the enemy." Hans could barely speak around the knot in his throat. "I never forget, Mrs. Henderson, never. You didn't just feed my body, you fed my soul. You saved me from becoming a man who hates." At the Harrisburg train station, dozens of German prisoners said goodbye to their American host families. The scene was unprecedented in military history, former enemies embracing like family members, promising to write, expressing genuine love for each other across the gulf of war. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something that would span generations. The correspondence began within weeks of Hans's return to war-torn Bavaria. Letters crossed the Atlantic monthly, carrying news, photographs, and enduring affection between former enemies who had become family. Hans wrote from his devastated village, "Dear Mrs. Henderson, I am safe home with Mutter and little Anna. Our village is much damaged, but we are alive and rebuilding. I tell everyone about American kindness. Some do not believe, but I have your photographs to prove. I am helping rebuild our church using construction methods you taught me. Every day I think of your kitchen, your strawberry jam, your gentle words. You are an angel God sent to show me that enemies can become family." Mrs. Henderson replied on her familiar blue stationery, "Dear Hans, Tommy made it home from the Pacific last month, wounded but healing. I told him all about you, and he says he hopes German families were half as kind to American prisoners as we were to you. I'm sending a care package with coffee, chocolate, and some of Anna's favorite cookies. Give your mother and sister my love. Tell them they raised a fine young man. The letters continued for years, documenting Germany's painful reconstruction and America's generous assistance through the Marshall Plan. Hans sent photographs of his marriage to a schoolteacher named Greta, the births of his children, his success as a contractor specializing in American building techniques. Other former prisoners maintained similar correspondence with their host families. The network of relationships that had begun in Pennsylvania kitchens became a bridge between nations learning to trust each other again. When the Marshall Plan began pouring billions into European reconstruction, many Americans were surprised by German receptivity to American aid. They didn't realize that thousands of German families had heard first-hand accounts of American generosity from sons and husbands who'd experienced it personally. Americans helped rebuild my Hans when he was broken by war, wrote Hans's mother to a relief organization. Now they help rebuild our broken country. This is Christian love in action. The most incredible moment was still coming. A reunion that would prove the lasting power of kitchen table diplomacy. Summer 1965, 20 years after the war's end. Mrs. Henderson, now 82 and slowed by arthritis but still tending her garden, received a letter that made her hands tremble. Dear Mrs. Henderson, I have saved money for many years to bring my family to America, to show them the place where their father learned that love is stronger than hate. Would it be possible to visit your farm? I want my children to see the kitchen where you taught an enemy to become a friend. Mit liebsten Grüßen, Hans Müller. The reunion lasted 3 weeks. Hans arrived with his wife Greta and their 3 children. Margaret, named for Mrs. Henderson, Robert, named for her late husband, and young Anna. They stayed in the farmhouse, sleeping in the same rooms where Hans had once been fed as a prisoner. Mrs. Henderson cooked the same meals she had prepared 20 years earlier: beef stew with fresh bread, fried chicken with mashed potatoes, strawberry shortcake with berries from the same patch. Hans's wife learned the recipes, determined to carry these tastes of reconciliation back to Germany. The children played in the same yard where their father had once stood as an enemy, now running freely through gardens he had planted, feeding chickens he had raised, swimming in the pond where he had learned to find peace. You know what this means? Mrs. Henderson asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Hans's children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Tell me, Hans replied, grey now threading his hair, but his eyes still holding the gratitude of that 19-year-old farm boy. Those children are playing where their father once stood as an enemy soldier. Now they're part of this family, part of this farm's story. That's how real peace works. One kitchen table at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one generation teaching the next that love can overcome fear. The visit was covered by local newspapers, then picked up nationally. Life magazine ran a photo spread titled, From Enemy to Family, How One Kitchen Changed 2 Lives. The story became a symbol of post-war reconciliation, proof that individual relationships could transcend national conflicts. Hans returned to Germany with more than memories. He carried business partnerships that would last decades, cultural exchange programs that would bring German students to Pennsylvania farms and American students to Bavarian villages. Mrs. Henderson lived to be 94, maintaining correspondence with Hans's family until her death in 1977. Hans named his construction company Henderson Müller International and specialized in projects that brought Americans and Germans together. Schools, hospitals, community centers built with both German engineering and American optimism. Today, their great-grandchildren are friends on social media, sharing photos of family gatherings that include both American barbecues and German Christmas markets, maintaining connections that began with a bowl of beef stew in a Pennsylvania farmhouse kitchen. Because sometimes the most important diplomacy doesn't happen in government buildings or conference rooms. Sometimes it happens in farmhouse kitchens, where one woman decides that feeding people is more important than hating them. Mrs. Henderson taught us that enemies are just people whose stories we haven't heard yet. That fear disappears when you share a meal. That one act of kindness can ripple across generations like stones thrown into still water. The question isn't whether we have people we consider enemies. The question is whether we have the courage to cook for them. The recipe is simple. Take one stranger, add kindness, season with dignity, serve with genuine care. Watch walls crumble like day-old bread. That lesson is still available to us today, in our own conflicts, our own divisions, our own choices about how we treat people who are different from us. The kitchen door is always open. The question is, do we have the courage to walk through it? A young German soldier stared at something he'd never seen before in his life, a library card with his name on it. Friedrich Weber, prisoner, bar 847. It read in neat English letters. The American guard smiled and said, "You can check out any book you want. Keep it as long as you need." This Wehrmacht corporal had been told Americans would break his spirit through brutality. Instead, they were trying to educate his mind through books. This is the story of the most unexpected weapon ever used in warfare, and it changed everything these prisoners believed about freedom, knowledge, and human dignity. But first, you need to understand what these German prisoners expected from American re-education. Friedrich Weber was 23 when captured during the Normandy campaign in July 1944. A baker's son from Dresden who'd been drafted at 18. He'd spent 5 years in a system that told him exactly what to think, what to read, and what to believe. In Nazi Germany, books were weapons to be controlled. Libraries were purged of dangerous ideas. Students learned only what the state deemed acceptable. Friedrich's entire education had been carefully curated to produce loyalty, not curiosity. "The Americans will try to poison your minds," his commanding officer had warned before the final assault. "They'll force you to read their propaganda, attend lectures about democracy, confess the superiority of their system. Resist this mental torture. Better to stay ignorant than become corrupted." German propaganda painted American re-education as sophisticated brainwashing. Prisoners would be strapped to chairs and forced to absorb capitalist lies. Their German identity would be systematically destroyed and replaced with foreign ideology. When the transport train arrived at Camp McCain, Mississippi, Friedrich braced himself for the intellectual assault. Surely they would confiscate any German books, forbid speaking German among prisoners, force attendance at political indoctrination sessions. Instead, something impossible happened. During orientation, the camp commander announced, "The library is open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. daily. You may check out books in German, English, or several other languages. English classes are available for those interested. All programs are voluntary." Voluntary? Friedrich exchanged glances with other prisoners. What kind of brainwashing was voluntary? Furthermore, the commander continued, "You may write letters, keep diaries, discuss ideas freely among yourselves. The only restriction is that you treat all materials and facilities with respect." This made no sense. Why would captors encourage prisoners to read freely, think independently, communicate without censorship? Where was the systematic mental control they'd been warned about? But when Friedrich first walked into that library, what he discovered would challenge everything he thought he knew about knowledge and power. The camp library occupied a converted barracks, its windows bright with natural light, its shelves lined with hundreds of books in multiple languages. Friedrich stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by possibilities he'd never imagined. German classics filled entire sections. Goethe, Schiller, Mann, Heine. But these weren't the sanitized, politically approved versions he'd known. These were complete works, including books that had been banned in Germany for over a decade. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, the camp librarian, was a retired schoolteacher from Jackson who'd volunteered for the POW education program. She approached Friedrich with genuine warmth, speaking careful German learned from immigrant neighbors. "What interests you?" she asked, as if he were any patron rather than an enemy prisoner. Friedrich hesitated. In Germany, admitting interest in the wrong subjects could be dangerous. But something in her kind face encouraged honesty. I like to read stories. Before war, I read many books." "Wonderful! What kind of stories?" "Adventure, travel, about other countries." Mrs. Kellerman's face lit up. She led him to a section he'd never seen before. Travel narratives, exploration accounts, stories of ordinary people living in distant lands. Books that had been forbidden in Germany as promoting cosmopolitanism and undermining racial purity. She pulled down a volume, Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, translated into German. "This is adventure and travel," she said. "But here's something special. We also have it in English if you want to compare. Reading the same story in different languages helps you understand both better." Friedrich stared at the two books. Identical stories in different tongues. In Germany, comparing German literature to foreign versions was considered treasonous. Here, it was encouraged as educational. "Take both if you like," Mrs. Kellerman suggested. "No rush to return them. Learning takes time." She handed him a library card with his name and prisoner number. Not a mark of shame, but an invitation to knowledge. That night, Friedrich sat on his bunk reading Werner's Adventure by the light of a bedside lamp. Another impossibility, as German POW camps rarely had individual lighting. Around him, Other prisoners read their own chosen books, technical manuals, philosophy, poetry, even American magazines. The silence was broken only by rustling pages and occasional whispered discussions about what they were discovering. But the real shock came when Friedrich attended his first English class and discovered what American propaganda actually looked like. The English classroom was another converted barracks, furnished with proper desks, a blackboard, and educational posters showing American geography and culture. 20 German prisoners had volunteered for the beginners class, mostly out of curiosity about their captor's language. Their teacher was Sergeant James Morrison, a former high school English instructor from Ohio who'd been assigned to the education program after losing his left arm in Italy. He walked to the front of the class with obvious nervousness. Teaching enemy soldiers hadn't been covered in his training. "Guten Tag," he began in heavily accented German. "Good day. Today we begin learning English together." Friedrich expected the first lesson to be political, American superiority, German failures, capitalist propaganda disguised as language instruction. Instead, Sergeant Morrison taught them basic greetings, numbers, and common phrases. "Hello, how are you? My name is..." "Thank you, please excuse me." Polite conversation, not political indoctrination. The textbooks were equally surprising. Instead of ideological content, they contained practical lessons, ordering food, asking directions, describing family members, discussing weather, the kind of language real people used in daily life. "Why do you teach us this?" asked Klaus Richter, a former philosophy student who spoke some English already. Sergeant Morrison considered the question carefully. "Because communication breaks down barriers. Because understanding each other's languages helps us understand each other's thoughts. Because maybe, when this war is over, we'll need to talk to each other as people, not as enemies." He pointed to a map of America on the wall. "This is my country. I love it, just like you love Germany. But loving your own country doesn't mean you have to hate everyone else's country. There's room in the world for different people to live different ways." This was revolutionary thinking for men raised in a system that preached racial hierarchy and national supremacy. As weeks passed, the English classes became more than language instruction. They became windows into American culture, values, and ways of thinking. Students learned about American democracy not through political lectures, but through practical examples. How Americans chose their leaders, how laws were made, how individuals could influence government. Not propaganda, but civics education. They studied American literature, not to prove American superiority, but to understand the American mind. Mark Twain's humor, Walt Whitman's poetry, Frederick Douglass's autobiography, stories that revealed American struggles, contradictions, and ideals. But the most shocking discovery was what happened when these German prisoners started asking questions their own education had never encouraged. 6 weeks into his imprisonment, Friedrich made a discovery that shattered his understanding of education itself. He was reading a book about American history when he encountered something impossible: honest discussion of American failures. The book didn't just praise American achievements, it criticized them. It described slavery, the treatment of Native Americans, economic inequality, political corruption. This made no sense. Why would Americans give prisoners books that revealed American weaknesses? He brought the book to Mrs. Kellerman confused. "This book says bad things about America," he said carefully. "Why you let me read this?" Mrs. Kellerman smiled. "Because truth isn't always pretty, Friedrich. A strong country can admit its mistakes and try to do better. That's how we improve. But in Germany, books only say good things about Germany. And what do you think of that now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Friedrich had never been asked to evaluate his own education before. In Germany, questioning the system was forbidden. Here, it was encouraged. That evening, Friedrich joined a discussion group that had formed spontaneously among prisoners. They met in the library after hours, debating ideas they'd encountered in their reading. "I read about American elections," said Hans Müller, a former bank clerk from Munich. "People can choose different candidates. They can vote against the government without being arrested." "I read about American newspapers," added Joseph Kramer. "They criticize the president, the military, the government. This is allowed?" Klaus Richter, who'd been reading philosophy, raised the most dangerous question of all. If Americans can criticize their own system, and we were never allowed to criticize ours, which system is stronger? The silence that followed was profound. These men were thinking forbidden thoughts, asking forbidden questions, reaching forbidden conclusions. Sergeant Morrison sometimes joined these discussions, not as a teacher, but as a participant. He answered their questions about America honestly, including difficult topics like racism, poverty, and political conflict. America isn't perfect, he admitted one evening. We have problems, big problems. But we try to solve them by talking about them, not by pretending they don't exist. And people don't go to prison for saying these problems exist? No. In fact, pointing out problems is considered patriotic. We believe criticism makes the country stronger. Friedrich struggled to process this concept. In Germany, criticism of the state was treason. Here, it was citizenship. But the real transformation began when these prisoners started writing and discovered their own voices for the first time. 3 months into captivity, the education program expanded to include creative writing workshops. Prisoners could write stories, essays, poems, letters, anything they wanted in German or English. Friedrich had never written creatively before. In German schools, writing assignments had predetermined answers. Students wrote what was expected, not what they thought or felt. The writing instructor, Miss Sarah Collins, was a young woman from the local teachers' college who'd volunteered to help with prisoner education. She gave them their first assignment: write about a place that makes you feel peaceful. Friedrich stared at the blank paper, paralyzed. What kind of place made him feel peaceful? He'd never been asked to examine his own emotions before. Slowly, carefully, he began to write about his grandfather's bakery in Dresden, the warm ovens, the smell of fresh bread, the quiet pride of creating something that nourished people. Writing in English forced him to think more carefully about each word, each emotion. When Miss Collins read his essay aloud to the class, Friedrich felt something he'd never experienced: pride in his own individual expression, not just in following orders correctly. Other prisoners wrote about their families, their homes, their dreams for after the war, topics that had nothing to do with politics or nationalism, just human experiences and emotions. Klaus wrote a poem about missing his younger sister. Hans wrote a story about teaching his son to fish. Joseph wrote an essay about wanting to travel and see the world. "These are beautiful," Miss Collins told them. "You have your own voices, your own perspectives. Don't let anyone ever tell you what to think or feel." The concept of having your own voice was revolutionary. In Germany, individual voices were supposed to merge into the collective voice of the state. Here, individual expression was celebrated as valuable. Friedrich began keeping a diary, writing daily observations about camp life, his changing thoughts, his growing questions about everything he'd been taught. For the first time in his life, his thoughts belonged to him alone. But the most dangerous moment came when these newly awakened minds encountered something that could get them killed as traitors. December 1944. News of the Holocaust began filtering into the camp through American newspapers and radio broadcasts. At first, the German prisoners dismissed it as Allied propaganda. The reports were too horrific to believe. Millions of civilians murdered in industrial killing facilities, systematic extermination based on race and religion, German doctors conducting medical experiments on human subjects. "This is lies," insisted Otto Weber, a former SS administrative officer. "Propaganda to make us feel guilty." But the evidence kept mounting. Photographs from liberated camps, testimonies from American soldiers who'd witnessed the atrocities, documents captured from German facilities. Mrs. Kellerman quietly placed books about the Holocaust in the library's German section. She said nothing, made no assignments, applied no pressure. She simply made the information available for those who chose to seek it. Friedrich chose to seek it. Reading about Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz was like having his soul torn apart. These facilities had operated while he served in the Wehrmacht. German civilians had lived near them, worked in them, profited from them. The systematic murder of millions had happened in his country, by his countrymen, in his name. The numbers were staggering. The methods were beyond comprehension. The bureaucratic efficiency was horrifyingly familiar. The same organizational skills that had made Germany a modern industrial nation had been turned toward genocide. That night, Friedrich couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything but the weight of collective guilt. He wasn't personally responsible for these crimes, but he was part of a system that had made them possible. He found Klaus sitting alone in the library, staring at photographs from Mauthausen. "Did you know?" Klaus whispered. "No," Friedrich replied. "But should I have known? Could I have known?" They sat in silence, two young men confronting the moral collapse of everything they'd been raised to believe in. Other prisoners reacted differently. Some retreated into denial. Others became angry at being deceived by Allied propaganda. A few suffered complete emotional breakdowns. But many, like Friedrich and Klaus, began asking the most dangerous question of all. If we were lied to about this, what else were we lied to about? The moral reckoning was just beginning, because what happened next would determine whether these men became bitter enemies or bridge builders for peace. The revelation of Nazi atrocities created a crisis in the camp. Some German prisoners demanded to be transferred away from the education program, refusing to read more Allied lies. Others became paralyzed by guilt and shame. But a third group, including Friedrich, made a different choice. They decided to learn everything they could about what had been done in their name and what they could do to prevent it from happening again. This group began meeting informally in the evenings, calling themselves the Reading Circle. They studied not just American books, but works by German authors who had fled the Nazi regime, writers whose books had been banned in Germany but were freely available in the camp library. Thomas Mann, writing in exile about German culture and responsibility. Heinrich Heine, the Jewish poet whose works had been burned by the Nazis. Bertolt Brecht, whose plays critiqued authoritarianism and militarism. These are German writers, Friedrich realized with shock. German voices that were silenced in Germany but speak freely in America. The irony was devastating. German literature was more accessible to German prisoners in an American camp than it had been to German citizens in their own country. Sergeant Morrison began attending their discussions, not as an authority figure, but as a fellow reader exploring difficult questions. Together, Germans and Americans wrestled with problems that had no easy answers. How could educated people commit such crimes? How could systems of government prevent such horrors? How could individuals resist when entire societies went wrong? Democracy isn't perfect, Morrison admitted during one late-night conversation, but it's based on the idea that power should be questioned, that leaders should be held accountable, that ordinary citizens have both the right and the responsibility to think for themselves. We were taught that individual thinking was selfish, Klaus said, that good citizens should follow orders without question. And look where that led, Morrison replied gently. Maybe individual conscience is the only protection against collective madness. Friedrich began writing letters to his family in Germany, trying to share what he was learning. But how could he explain that he was receiving a better education as a prisoner in America than he'd ever received as a free citizen in Germany? But the real test of their transformation was yet to come, when these German prisoners faced a choice that would define their futures. Spring 1945. Germany surrendered, but repatriation would be delayed for months due to the chaos in occupied Europe. The POW education program continued, with prisoners now able to choose more advanced courses: American history, political science, economics, literature. Friedrich enrolled in a course called Democratic Institutions, taught by a professor from the University of Mississippi. The class examined how democratic societies organized themselves, how citizens participated in government, how conflicts were resolved through debate rather than violence. For the first time in his life, Friedrich was encouraged to disagree with authority. When the professor presented an idea, students could challenge it, offer alternative viewpoints, engage in respectful argument. "What do you think, Friedrich?" the professor asked during a discussion about free speech. Should people be allowed to criticize their government? The old Friedrich would have looked for the correct answer, the response that authority figures wanted to hear. The new Friedrich gave his honest opinion. I think criticism prevents bigger problems. If people cannot speak about small injustices, those injustices grow into large ones. Maybe if Germans could have criticized early Nazi policies, later atrocities would not have happened. The professor nodded approvingly. Excellent analysis. Dissent can be patriotic when it prevents greater harm. As repatriation approached, camp authorities made an extraordinary offer. Prisoners who wanted to continue their education could apply to American universities. The US government would provide scholarships for former enemy soldiers who committed to using their education for peaceful purposes. Friedrich faced the most important decision of his life. He could return to destroyed Germany and try to rebuild from the ruins. Or he could stay in America, complete his education, and eventually return to Germany as a bridge between two former enemy nations. Klaus chose to stay, enrolling at the University of Mississippi to study international relations. "I want to understand how countries can resolve conflicts without war," he explained. Hans decided to return home immediately. "My family needs me now, but I'll take books with me, and everything I've learned here." Friedrich chose a middle path. He would return to Germany, but maintain connections with America through correspondence courses and cultural exchanges. These choices would have consequences that nobody could have predicted, because what these men did next would help reshape the relationship between two nations. The return to Germany was a profound shock. Dresden had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Friedrich's family bakery was gone, his father dead in the final days of fighting, his mother and sister living in a basement shelter with a dozen other refugees. But Friedrich returned with something most German civilians lacked: hope and a plan for rebuilding not just structures, but entire ways of thinking. He used his American education to establish a small school in the ruins of Dresden, teaching English to German children and adults. But he taught more than language. He taught democratic values, critical thinking, and respect for individual conscience. "In America, I learned that questions are not dangerous," he told his students. "Questions lead to answers. Answers lead to solutions. Solutions lead to progress." His curriculum included books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, but were freely available in American libraries. German students read German authors for the first time, discovering their own cultural heritage that had been hidden from them. Klaus, who had stayed in America to complete his degree, became a translator and cultural liaison for the US occupation forces. His insider knowledge of both German and American mentalities made him invaluable in bridging cultural gaps and preventing misunderstandings. Hans, who had returned immediately to Germany, used techniques learned in the camp library to organize community reading groups. Former Nazi strongholds became centers for democratic discussion, as ordinary Germans encountered ideas they'd never been allowed to consider. The correspondence network established in the POW camp continued for decades. Former prisoners maintained relationships with their American teachers, librarians, and fellow students. These personal connections became the foundation for broader cultural exchanges between Germany and America. Mrs. Kellerman retired from the Mississippi library system but continued corresponding with dozens of former German prisoners. She sent care packages during Germany's difficult Reconstruction years, books to support their continuing education, and encouragement for their efforts to build a democratic society. "You were my best students," she wrote to Friedrich in 1947. "Not because you agreed with everything you read, but because you learned to think for yourselves. That's what education should do. Create independent minds, not obedient followers." But the most remarkable testament to their transformation was still to come: a reunion that would prove the lasting power of books and ideas. Summer 1964, 20 years after the war ended, the University of Mississippi organized a conference on education and democracy, featuring speakers from around the world. Among the invited guests were several former German POWs who had participated in the camp education programs. Friedrich, now a successful educator and author in Germany, returned to Camp McCain, now converted to a civilian college. Klaus, who had become a professor of international relations, flew in from his university position in California. Hans came from Germany, where he ran a publishing house specializing in democratic literature. Mrs. Kellerman, though retired, attended the conference as an honored guest. Sergeant Morrison, who had left the military to become a high school principal, served as master of ceremonies. The reunion took place in the same barracks that had once housed the camp library. The shelves were still there, now filled with books donated by the former prisoners. German editions of American classics, American editions of German literature, textbooks on democracy and human rights written by scholars from both countries. "This room changed my life," Friedrich told the audience during his speech. "I came here as an enemy soldier who had been taught not to think. I left as a free man who had learned to question everything, including my own assumptions." Klaus added, "The most important lesson we learned here wasn't about America or Germany. It was about the power of education to transform enemies into friends, soldiers into scholars, hatred into understanding." The conference proceedings were published in multiple languages and distributed to schools throughout Europe and America. The story of German POWs educated in American camps became a model for post-conflict reconciliation programs worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Kellerman presented a special gift to her former students: library cards from the original Camp McCain library, laminated and preserved as historical artifacts. "You'll always be members of this library," she said with tears in her eyes. "You'll always have the right to check out knowledge, to question authority, to think for yourselves." Here's what this story really teaches us. The most powerful weapon ever created isn't nuclear or chemical or biological. It's a library card in the hands of someone who's been denied the right to read freely. The German POWs at Camp McCain weren't defeated by superior firepower or strategic brilliance. They were transformed by access to ideas, by the freedom to question, by the revolutionary concept that every individual mind has value. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields. Sometimes they're won in classrooms where former enemies learn to think together. Sometimes the strongest defense against totalitarianism is a well-stocked library and the radical belief that everyone deserves access to knowledge. That lesson is still available today, in our own conflicts, our own divisions, our own choices about how we educate ourselves and others. The question isn't whether we have access to information. Most of us do. The question is whether we have the courage to seek out ideas that challenge our assumptions, to read books that make us uncomfortable, to engage with thoughts that might change our minds. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can give an enemy is a library card. And sometimes that's exactly what the world needs.